Amen. We'll get started. Tonight's teaching I've titled Learning to Think Like God Thinks, and we'll be in Exodus chapter 22 and perhaps in Exodus chapter 23. And one of the things we learn from this is that God, especially if we read everything that and put it together as a lifestyle, if we can morph this away from just reading individual commandments to getting what is God doing here? What is the big picture? What's the 10,000-foot view? And so much of it is being true to Him, being true to what's true, and elevating others above ourselves. And this is a theme, as you know, that's all the way through the scripture. For example, in Proverbs 19, verse 17, it says, "The one who shows favor to a poor person lends to Yahweh, and He will repay him according to his good work." So we think of poor people and disadvantaged people as better than ourselves, knowing that as we give to them, that's like just you might as well take something and lend it to Yahweh, because He's going to repay you for it. Or we look in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, don't do anything out of selfish ambition or out of conceit, but in humility value others as more important than yourselves. And that's along the lines of, love your neighbor as yourself and that kind of thing. By the way, while we're talking about this, learning to think like God thinks, the world is going in a different direction. The world is becoming more selfish, more self-centered. And a great example of that is some of the new teachings I've heard on the second commandment, which is love your neighbor like yourself. And I've heard it taught that, well, the real problem is we don't love ourselves enough. And we need to take more time for ourselves and more personal time and more this for us and more that for us. And the fact of the matter is, the scripture says no person ever hated their own flesh, but pampers it. And we instinctively love ourselves. I mean, if you think about what you wear, what you do, where you go, why you live where you live, we instinctively love ourselves. The problem is not loving ourselves. The problem is that we are not loving others the way we love ourselves. Now, granted, there are people that don't walk wisely when it comes to taking care of themselves. And we're not talking about that. We are supposed to get enough sleep. We are supposed to eat the right kind of food. We are supposed to be in fellowship with people we really love, that kind of thing. That's simply walking in wisdom. But if we walk in wisdom, we'll find that we really are loving ourselves. And now we need to reach that out and give that to other people. So let's go to Exodus chapter 22. And the first thing I want to do is I want to skip down to verse 3, because there's a key here in verse 3 that points to the importance of Exodus 21, 22, and 23, which are the initial laws after the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20 and 21, 22, 23 are the initial laws that God gave for humankind to govern itself and govern society. So in verse 3, it says, "But if the sun is risen on him," and we'll pick up the context. We'll go back and redo this verse. I just want to start here. "But if the sun is risen on him, there will be guilt for bloodshed incurred. A thief is to make restitution, yes, restitution. If he has nothing, then he's to be sold because of his theft." This phrase, restitution, yes, restitution, is actually two Hebrew words. They're the same Hebrew word. They just are in different verbal aspects. They're verbs. And so the first one is an infinitive. The second one is not an imperative. And now it goes flying right out of my head. The first is an infinitive, and the next is, I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, it's kind of like if it said to run and running. It's the same word, and it's repeated twice, boom, boom. And that's the figure of speech polyptyton. When you repeat the same word twice, but the words are in different verbal aspects, That's the figure of speech polyptoton. If you repeat the same word twice and it's exactly the same word in every way, then that's repetitio. So this is polyptoton. So polyptoton then is a figure that's going to draw our attention to these chapters. And in chapter 21, we have 10 polyptotons. In chapter 22, we have 13. In chapter 23, we have 5. So we have these polyptotons that are saying, look at me, yet you read chapter 20, the 3 more chapters, 24, 25, and 26. You know how many polyptotons there are? 0. So what God is doing is he's saying, look, I'm giving you this law and I want you to pay really close attention to it. So that's one of the reasons that it helps us as English readers to know that and then focus on this. So we go back now, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, meaning that you can't get it back from him, it's either dead or sold, he must pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. And why is there more? Why do you have to pay more for an ox? Because a sheep, they just kind of stand there and go by, and every once in a while you can shear them and take their wool. But oxen are trained for work. So an oxen, you've put time and energy and effort, plus working around an untrained ox is inherently dangerous. We're working around a sheep, really about the worst they can do is step on your foot if you get too close. And even that doesn't hurt much because I've had that happen before. So, what is the law saying? The law is saying that your time and your effort is intrinsically valuable. And that needs to be reflected in the laws of the land. That if somebody, you could go out and buy, let's say you go out to some store, I don't know, down the road from us is a Home Depot. They sell lawnmowers. So you go to Home Depot and you buy a lawnmower and somebody steals it. You can just go to Home Depot and get another lawnmower. If you have the money to do it, you just replace it. It's no big deal. But let's say you hand carved the fence in front of your house so that it looked really nice and somebody came along and stole that. You just can't go buy another one of those. And the law recognizes the value of your work. So in learning to think like God thinks, again, reflecting on these laws and saying, okay, God, what are you telling me about life? What are you telling about me about yourself, myself? Your work, your effort is worth something. And that needs to be reflected. Protecting that needs to be reflected in the laws of the land. So 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep. Now, this is where, when I was teaching Sunday morning out of Exodus 21, and I taught on risk and responsibility, if you're a thief, this is the risk. If you steal something valuable and you've got to repay 5 times its worth, you better be in a position to make that payment, or, as we will see, you're going to end up being sold as a slave. So then verse 2, if the thief is found in the act of breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no guilt for bloodshed incurred. And this is reflected in a lot of American law, that if you see, if there's a thief, for example, breaking into your house, coming in through a window, and that thief is shot and killed in righteous communities, righteous states, there's no punishment for that. Because what's the guy doing? See, when somebody is breaking in, you have no way of evaluating the threat. You don't know if he's got a gun on his hip or not. You don't know what his situation is or her situation. You have no way to evaluate the threat. Here it is. It says, if the thief is found in the act of breaking in, the Hebrew is actually digging through, because most of the houses were mud or some form of mud and stone. And so the way a thief would get in is they would dig through the wall. And here it says, and usually you wouldn't dig through in broad daylight because somebody'd hear you or see you, because there's a lot of people around. And so basically, if you're digging through the wall in the middle of the night. There's no way to assess the threat. And so the homeowner takes his stick or whatever, or a knife, and stabs you or clubs you and you die. It's like, that's the risk of breaking in. But then verse 3, if the sun has risen on him, now what's that mean? That means that there's a way of assessing the threat. You can make an assessment about whether or not this guy is a genuine danger, or if he's just, some teenage thief that's looking for, some extra money for something. So it says, if the sun is risen on him, there will be guilt for bloodshed incurred. So the Bible then sets standards. If we're going to think like God thinks, remember that we're valuing human life. We're valuing society so that we're willing to put criminals to death. But we're valuing human life in the sense that we're recognizing that people can be rehabilitated and that kind of thing. We don't want to just kill people for the sake of killing people. If you have to kill people to protect yourself or society, the Bible allows for that. But otherwise, the Bible says, wait a minute, hold on. Life is valuable. We don't need to go that far. So verse 3 says, if the sun's risen on him, you can properly evaluate the threat. You can yell and get help to subdue this guy. Then you don't get to kill him, or else there's guilt for the bloodshed. And that then would be handled by what the Bible calls the avenger of blood, which would be his relatives. And you would have to go and hide in like a city of refuge or something. So then it goes on and says, okay, the thief is to make restitution. So let's say the guy's now broken in, he's taken something, he's gotten caught with it, he's to make restitution. If he has nothing, then he's to be sold because of his theft. And then we know what happens in the biblical world is he's sold into slavery. He would be taken to the town. There would be the judges and people that would keep him, captive, if you will. And then different people would come forward and say, okay, I'll buy this guy or whatever. So the money is paid for him, and that money would go to the family that was hurt. That's one of the things that I find to be really unfair about American law. Like, for example, somebody comes and steals your car and wrecks it and totals it, and the law expects you to have insurance to pay for that, because the guy who stole your car can pay a fine or go to jail, but you don't get that money. The state gets that money. Wait a minute, they didn't steal a state car. They didn't go to a police station or the governor's mansion and steal a state car. They stole your car. Why aren't you getting the money? That would be biblical restitution. But this is where it's probably not going to happen. As much as I'd like to think that some lawmakers would read the Bible and get this and understand it and say, whoa, I just saw the light. I'm willing to change things. I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, that's the way it worked in the biblical world. And then we know that biblical slavery was different than, say, Roman slavery, Greek slavery, European slavery, American slavery. The slave was not considered owned. The master did not have the right to kill the slave. In fact, if the master knocked out a tooth or blinded an eye, the slave went free. The slave only served for 7 years, and even after he was through serving, he had to be supplied with food and things to get a good start in life. So there was a lot of differences between slavery in the biblical world and of Israel and slavery in the rest of the world. It's so different, in fact, that I really dislike the word slavery. It's almost more like a very limited indentured servitude type of thing. But anyway, he's sold because of his theft. Verse 4. If what was stolen is found, yes, found in his hand alive, whether it's an ox, donkey, or sheep, he must pay double. Now the double includes returning what he stole. So actually, in this case, he'd be very fortunate if when he stole somebody's ox, say, for example, and ran off with it. Then he's caught. Now he's got to restore double. If he'd had time to kill it, he'd have to pay 5 oxen. But because it's alive and simply is returned to its owner, then he returns that ox and has to add one more to it. And that, again, that shows us that there's mercy and grace in the law. It's not retribution for retribution's sake. Oh, by the way, while I'm thinking about that, when it says, that if he has nothing, he's to be sold because of his theft, that's God's mercy and grace in valuing a human being, valuing the life of a human being. Because if you read the Code of Hammurabi, now the Code of Hammurabi is a Babylonian law code that predates the Mosaic law by some number of hundreds of years. And in the Code of Hammurabi, paragraph 8, which you can Google, by the way, just if you want to read it yourself, just Google the Code of Hammurabi. If you want to read paragraph 8, just even Google Code of Hammurabi, paragraph 8. But in the Code of Hammurabi, if a thief stole something and then couldn't repay it, he was executed. So in God's law, he says no, he just serves for 7 years, see if he can get his life straightened out. In the law codes of the ancient world that didn't recognize justice and mercy, you stole something, you couldn't come up with the cash to cover the cost, they executed you. That was as simple as it was. So once again, when we're reading this and learning to think like God thinks, we think about justice for the victim. We also think about the value of human life buried in the midst of this. Now, verse 5. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard, or lets his animal loose and it grazes in another man's field, he is to make restitution from the best of his own field and from the best of his own vineyard. Now, if we look at this, one of the things that we learn is many times we think in kind of American mind think, well, if it's an accident, then there shouldn't be a punishment. I mean, after all, it was an accident. Come on. Well, okay, so here you have verse 5, and the first is on purpose. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard, this is a wealthy person, a powerful person who is I just remembered the second verb, imperfect. It's funny how that popped up in my brain. I was thinking about the person as imperfect, but anyway, in the polyptoton, the first verb is an infinitive and the second verb is an imperfect. Ta-da, okay. So in this case, you've got a rich man, a wealthy man, somebody who is privileged, that kind of thing. And so he's a bully. And so he sees somebody else's field and he simply brings his livestock over there to graze. That's done on purpose. But then the next thing goes on to say, or he lets his animal loose. He's just, la, la, la. He's kind of a space cadet, and he lets his animal loose, and it runs off, and it just goes and accidentally grazes in another man's field. Now, maybe a very liberal mindset might say, yeah, but one of them was done on purpose, and the other was an accident, so the punishment shouldn't be the same. Remember, we're learning to think like God thinks. God's thinking about the person who worked his field and grew that crop, who doesn't have a crop anymore because somebody's animal ate it. So from God's perspective, the crime is the same. You let your animal eat somebody else's field that wasn't yours, that they worked for. And because of that, the punishment is the same. And it says, if you do either of those things, he is to make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. And why is it going to be the best? Because you have no way of evaluating what the animal ate. And, the animal's already eaten it. You can't go in and say, well, that wasn't very good grain. Well, it was sure good enough that the animal liked it. So when you're making restitution, you don't get to go through your grain and look for the scrawniest grain. that you have, and then give that. You give from the best of your field, and it's the responsibility of the local judges to make sure that happens. Because, as in the case of the first guy who's a bully and privileged, um, you know, he's not willingly going to give the best of his field. So this is where the judges have to enforce the law. And so there's the law, and behind the law, there's people who enforce it. And that's always a weak link, because the Bible, in many cases, talks about how the judges are bribed. In fact, we'll get into that here if we get into chapter 23. So the judges can be a weak link, but they're supposed to oversee things and realize that they themselves will be judged by God for the way they fulfill their responsibility. So we get into the same thing then in verse 6. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns. Now, the thorns in Israel, they're dry, they're stickly, and boy, do they burn quick. They flash fire really fast, really hot. And of course, if there's any wind at all, they get blown around. So you've got a fire there, and it breaks out and it catches in the thorns. And the result of that then is the thorns spread the fire greatly, so that the shocks of grain or the standing grain or the field are consumed. Now, a shock of grain, that's what you call when you go through and you harvest the grain with a sickle, and they had hand sickles. And you harvest the grain with a sickle, and then you stand it up in a little thing. And on Halloween you see those where you see grain that's stood up and wrapped around, and it's in little piles. Those things are called shocks. Then the standing grain is the grain that hasn't been harvested yet, or the field itself, if it's just ripening. If your fire consumed those, the one who started the fire is to make restitution. Yes, restitution. And again, this is about the victim and what's happened to the victim. Now, interestingly enough, again, verse 6, somebody would think, well, but that was an accident. That was an accident, as if the guy's field didn't burn up. It doesn't matter. Some man who put a lot of time and energy and was expecting to feed his family one way or another from that field now lost his field. He needs to be made whole. And when it says, by the way, if fire breaks out, we've got to remember the culture. This is a culture that cooked food over open fires. They didn't have electric ovens or gas ovens or gas little stoves that kept everything nice and open. Boy, in this culture, if it was cooked, it was usually cooked over an open fire. They did have clay ovens, but even the clay ovens just were a fire inside what amounted to a giant pot, which was still some kind of open fire. So the people in this culture had been around open fires their whole life. They had seen how fires behaved. They knew what happens when there was a wind, and it's just so for I can just see, if you went back 4,000 years to the time of Abraham, say, and you were reading this verse with Abraham, and he'd just look at you cross-eyed and say, if fire breaks out, what kind of nut are you? People who we watch over our little fires because we know the damage they can do, and they really did. So this is it's not just an accident. It's a monumental lack of judgment or care or concern or whatever you want to call it. And again, what God's focus is on the victim. So basically, this is where he's telling people, look, if we will enforce penalties for accidents, there will be less accidents. But we have to keep the victims in mind. And again, what the devil has managed to do in the modern world is, somebody, for example, somebody, I'll give you one when that I read about when I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was 4th of July, and fireworks are illegal in North Carolina, but they're not illegal in South Carolina. So a lot of people drove across the state line and got fireworks. And so some guy was shooting off Roman candles in his yard illegally, and the Roman candle tipped over, and the Roman candle fired up into, and you guys have seen attics of houses, and the attics have those louvers that are kind of pointed downward and open, or maybe they have a thin screen behind them to keep bugs out, but they're louvered down, and that Roman candle just went right up into that louver, right through that little screen, and blew up in the guy's attic and burned the house down. Now, at that point, I mean, I don't remember the news report about what happened to the guy that illegally fired off the Roman candle, but I'll tell you what didn't happen. He didn't pay for the house he burned down. You know, the man had to have homeowners insurance, which probably had a huge deductible, and he has to pay for his own house. In the biblical world, if you burn somebody else's house down, you would pay for it. And that doesn't happen in the United States of America. And frankly, I think in many countries. And this is where we need to change our thinking to be more biblical if we're going to truly protect the victims. No wonder victims don't feel very protected. The law really doesn't protect us well from that standpoint. God's law would. So anyway, that's about the fires and accidents. Verse 7, if a man gives his neighbor money or goods for safekeeping, and it's stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he must pay double. Give back what you stole and match it. Verse 8, if the thief is not found, then the owner of the house must come near to the judges to see if he's put his hand to his neighbor's property. In other words, did the guy spend it, kill it, need it, whatever would happen, and then claim that it was stolen. So they've got to go before the judges. Verse 9, for every matter of transgression, whether it's for an ox, a donkey, a sheep, clothing, any kind of lost thing about what one can say, this is mine. In other words, it's a physical object. You can look at it and say, this is mine. The claim of both parties is to come before the judges, and he whom the judges condemn must pay double to his neighbor. So if the judges are not satisfied and say, no, doesn't make sense to us, there was a thief there, I'm sorry, you had too many people, somebody would have seen him, there's no evidence, never showed up anywhere else, then the judges would say, no, you're guilty. You somehow or other spent that, killed it, ate it, or whatever, then he would have to pay double back. Verse 10, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey or ox or sheep or any animal for safekeeping, and it has died or injured or is carried away without anyone seeing it, the oath made before Yahweh is to be between them both, that he has not laid his hands on his neighbor's property, and his owner must accept it. He will not make restitution. Now, this is part of the risk of the law. If you give your stuff to somebody else, and then somehow or other, you've got to go away on vacation. You can't you can't take your dog. So you give your dog to a neighbor and the dog dies. And, the neighbor doesn't know what happened. The dog just died. And, you come back and it's like, my dog's dead. And the neighbor says, yeah, I don't know what happened. He just died. Then the Bible says, look, that's the risk you take when you hand somebody else your stuff. So, the oath of Yahweh, the oath made before Yahweh is supposed to be good enough, and that's going to handle it. And so then, let's see. So that was verse 10. Verse 12. But if it was stolen, yes, stolen from him, he must make restitution to its owner. Well, wait a minute, verse 12. How would you know it was stolen? You caught the thief. So there's some things here that are kind of between the lines. It doesn't say that you caught the thief, but you know that the animal didn't wander off, but was stolen because you caught the thief. And then the thief must make restitution. Verse 13, if it's torn, yes, torn to pieces by wild animals, he must bring it as evidence. What does that mean? The wild animals always left some kind of evidence. There'd be a bone, there'd be a piece of hide, there would be some kind of evidence that your animal was torn apart. This actually shows up in Amos chapter 3. Let's go to the book of Amos and look at Amos chapter 3. And so Amos is talking in verse 12, and he says, "This is what Yahweh says. As the shepherd rescues out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so will the children of Israel be rescued who sit in Samaria on the corner of a couch and on the silken cushions of a bed." And without going much into the context, in other words, God is saying the people in Samaria are such sinners, they're going to be eaten by the lions, in this case, the encroaching Assyrians and stuff. And there's not going to be much left of them other than a couple legs or a piece of an ear. But verse 12, why would the shepherd rescue out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear? To be able to prove to the owner of the flock or herd that the animal was torn. And that's by another wild animal. And that's what Exodus 22 is talking about. Verse 13, if it's torn, yes, torn to pieces by wild animals, he must bring it as evidence. He can't simply say, well, I'm sorry, it was eaten up by another animal. He's got to have that evidence. And then once he does, he will not make restitution for what is torn. The risk in owning animals is that something can come and eat them. I have a friend in South Carolina who has chickens, and until recently, he hasn't had any kind of cage for them, and they keep getting eaten by hawks. And that's it's like you got chickens. Everything eats chickens, and if you leave the top of their pen uncovered, then the birds of prey are going to get them, and that's as simple as it is. But there's always a feather or something left to be able to tell what's going on. So it's just part of the risk of owning animals, and you don't make restitution. Now, verse 14 and 15 are really interesting. If a man borrows anything of a neighbor's and it is injured or died, and we would say injured, died, or broken, its owner not being with it, he must make restitution. Yes, restitution. And so let's say, for example, that your lawnmower is being repaired, so you want to borrow your neighbor's lawnmower. And you go to your neighbor and you say, I'd like to borrow your lawnmower to mow my lawn. And he says, yes. Now, if that lawnmower breaks down while you're using it and he's not there, biblically, you're responsible to get that lawnmower fixed. So what does that mean? If you need to go borrow your neighbor's lawnmower, you have a couple options. One is look the lawnmower over really carefully, or whatever it is you're borrowing. Look it over really carefully and make sure that it's not going to fall apart on you. I just had a situation where my mother-in-law owns a property in South Carolina, and Genevieve and I went there to spend the night on our way on vacation. It was at an early point, and we were asked, can you go mow the lawn? And so I got this lawnmower out from underneath the deck of the house, and it looked like it had just gotten off Noah's Ark. It had a wire hanging out the side. It was rickety, all covered in dirt. And I thought to myself, this is not a good situation. Sure enough, I pull on the cord and the cord comes right out. So it's like, ah! And, thankfully, because I'm the son-in-law, somehow or other, as a part of the family, I don't have to pay to get that lawnmower repaired. It would need a whole lot more than a new cord, I guarantee it. But I could have looked at that lawnmower and just looked at Genevieve and said, there's no way in the world I'm trying to mow the lawn with this lawnmower. Ain't gonna happen. It's probably gonna break. I'll go rent a lawnmower before I'll try and get this thing started. But anyway, so that's, just to be aware that biblically, if you borrow something, and you're going to walk away with it. The owner's back at their house. So you take it home to your place. If it breaks, biblically, you're responsible for it. Now, what's the answer to that? Verse 15, if the owner is with it, he will not make restitution. So if you need to borrow your neighbor's lawnmower, you say, hey, I'll tell you what, while I'm mowing my lawn, why don't I buy you a couple beers and you can sit in my chair and watch and have a couple beers and I'll mow the lawn. And that way, if he's there with it and it breaks, it's like, well, you can tell I didn't do anything wrong. All I did was try to use your lawnmower. I'm sorry. Here's your lawnmower back. And that's a neat way to protect yourself if you have to borrow any of your neighbor's stuff. If its owner is with it, he will not make restitution. If it was rented, the loss is covered by its rent. So that's true too. Like if you go to Home Depot and rent any power tools and they break, and Home Depot wants you to pay for it or something, it's like, nope, I'm sorry. Biblically, it's covered by its rent. Make sure that's in the contract, because everybody else and their brothers used it before you and not cared for it. So this is God's just taking care of people. He's making sure that people who are nice and loan things get covered in case what they loan is misused and broken. And it's also covering the person who needs to borrow something if they use wisdom so that they're protecting. Then verse 16, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a bride price for her to be his wife. We learn in Deuteronomy that bride price is 50 shekels of silver. So this is sex before marriage. God says, you pay the bride price and she becomes your wife. But then verse 17, if her father refuses to give her to him, and that could happen. The father could say, like the Hatfields and McCoys, our family doesn't like your family. I'm not giving my daughter to you to wife or whatever. We've got other plans for her. The father of the family had the right to do that in biblical law. In today's world, once a girl reaches 18, she's on her own. She can make her own decision. The father doesn't have that right. I can see good in both, but I happen to favor the American law. I think at some point you've got to let people be wise enough to make up their own decisions. In the biblical law, it wasn't played out that way. But interestingly enough, in verse 17, if the father refused to give the woman to the man, he's still got to pay the money according to the bride price. He still has to pay the 50 shekels. So here's your risk and responsibility. If you're a young man and you're going to seduce a virgin, you're going to seduce a young woman, then you're taking a risk because one of two things is going to happen. One thing that's going to happen is you're going to pay 50 shekels of silver. That's going to happen. What may happen is you get a wife that the law will forbid you from divorcing. Another thing that may happen is you may pay the 50 shekels and her father say, no, you don't get to marry my daughter. We're going to do something else with our family. Go away. So this is the risk and responsibility. In the biblical world, the responsible thing is and in that time period, you guys know they did contractual marriage. It wasn't that a man fell in love with a woman and ran off. It was you went to the parents, and generally your parents met her parents, and if the families were compatible, then they would discuss the terms of the marriage and the dowry and all that stuff. I was driving through rural Turkey one time, and we'd go past these villages. And in these villages, as you drive by them, and they were small, they would be what in America would be 10 or 12 blocks. And you go through a village and 10 or 12 blocks, and you go through another village. And periodically, in the villages, there would be, in the chimney, there would be a Coke bottle turned upside down. Well, after we'd been through a number of these villages and I saw these houses that looked normal and then these houses that had Coke bottles turned upside down, I said to the guy, I said, what's the deal with the houses that have a Coke bottle in their chimney? And he said, "Oh, that means they have available an available girl inside that they would like to be married." And so families that have a young man that they would like to be married, then they know the neighborhood, they know the family, and if they see the Coke bottle, then they usually what starts with the mother, and the mother of the man goes and meets the mother of the girl, and they have tea together and talk together, and if they like each other, then the men get involved. If the women don't like each other, it's done. That's kind of, that's that's just kind of the way it is. So, but if the women like each other, then the men get involved, and usually men are very amenable to this. They want to get the son married and that kind of thing. So, and then the marriage contract is made up, and that's kind of the way it works. But in this case, this is what it was saying: the risk and responsibility if you're a young man and you seduce a girl in this culture, that's what's going to go on. Then we have three verses starting in verse 18, 19, and 20. And they seem to be disconnected at first. You must not allow a sorceress to live. Whoever has sex with an animal must be put to death. Yes, death. He who sacrifices to the gods except the Yahweh only is to be devoted to destruction. First thing we note is that in all three cases, the person is put to death. And God, normally the phrase death, yes, death was very common in the book of Exodus. That would be what we would consider the standard way to talk about it. Not allowed to live is very rare. Devoted to destruction falls somewhere in the middle. But the way it's structured in the Hebrew with the different ways to talk about putting this person to death, it would immediately grab somebody's attention. Now, when I talk sometimes about having to unlearn things, one of the things I had to unlearn about the Bible is that the Bible does not interpret itself. The events in the Bible and the vocabulary in the Bible, the things that happen in the Bible were a part of the culture, just like we learned about marriage. You know, we learn about how it worked with marriage and how the father could refuse to marry his daughter and that kind of thing. And you learn that from the culture. And here we learn things about the culture. Now, a bottom line that we're going to learn here is these three verses are a triad, if you will. They go together, and they're all about God's war with pagan gods, or as you and I would know it, God's war with demons. Because you must not allow a sorceress to live. By the way, they use sorceress here. It's not that sorcerers were allowed to live, but that in the magic arts, because so much of it was done behind the scenes in the culture, most of the sorceresses or the witches were women. There were men involved, but most of them were women, and that's why it says sorceress here. And the sorceress is a woman who is not relying on Yahweh, but is in relying on demons in various disguises, whether you call it forces of nature or whatever you want to call it. But she is engineering world things that are engineered behind the scenes by demons to cause changes in the world. And whether that's a death curse, whether that's a love potion, whatever it is, it's not using love, it's not using Yahweh and God, and it is employing demons and bringing them into the society of Israel, because by her actions and thoughts, she is bringing demons into the society of Israel, and we know what demons do. They only come to steal and kill and destroy. So God says we don't want that kind of person in the Israeli society, the Israelite society. Verse 19, whoever has sex with an animal must be put to death. Yes, death. This is something where we really didn't have an understanding of what this meant until the 1800s and early 1900s, when we had deciphered Ugaritic, Moabite, Akkadian, and some of the cognate languages that are around there. And what you find out was that they in certain cultures, for example, in I'm going to say it was the Ugaritic culture, that you had sex with a horse or donkey to please certain gods. And then even in the myths, Baal had sex with a cow to to uh, get enough spell power to ward off Mot, the god of death. Um, and so sex with animals was used in the culture to gather, more spiritual power to be able to fight in the demonic world. So it's not, when we think of temple prostitutes and stuff, I think, where I know years and years ago when I thought of temple prostitutes, all I thought of is that men were lustful and the women needed money or something. But then you find out that the whole thing is all involved with sympathetic magic, and that by having sex with the temple prostitutes, the idea is that the gods are watching, and then because you're fertilizing this prostitute, they're going to fertilize the land and you're going to have an abundant harvest. So the connection is we have sex in the temple and the gods make our land abundant. And it's all about pagan gods and sympathetic magic. And so that's how number 1, verse 18, and number 2, verse 19 fit together. Then 20 is simply obvious. He who sacrifices to the gods except the Yahweh only is to be devoted to destruction, because anybody who's doing that, who's in the Israelite society, is bringing in those demons that then wreak havoc in the society. So remember that God is trying to keep Israel as a holy people, a holy nation, and as an incubator for the Messiah who's going to deliver the world from evil when he comes. And so God has to protect the Israelite society from the free incursion of demons. And that's one of the ways he's going to do it. A sorceress, you've got to put to death. If you're having sex with animals to empower yourself spiritually and gain favor with the gods, we're putting you to death too. And if you sacrifice to gods and invite those demons in, we put you to death too. And again, this is about protecting the society spiritually. Now, after the day of Pentecost, every Christian gets Holy Spirit. And that Holy Spirit then comes with an inherent armor that you can put on. So when you read Ephesians 6, by the time you're reading the church epistles and stuff, we're not going out and killing sorceresses. We're not killing people that had sex with animals, even though I would frown on it very highly. But the fact of the matter is, we now war in the spirit at a different level and keep the demons at bay by our spiritual warfare, and not by killing people in our society who are inviting those spirits in. So that's what's going on in that era or arena. So now we go, verse 21, you must not wrong a foreigner, nor are you to oppress him, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. This is not a causal for you were foreigners. You're not wronging a foreigner just because you were once one. It's not causal. The word for is not causal, it's ethical. You don't wrong a foreigner, you don't oppress him, because ethically you now know that was wrong because it happened to you. So it's not a tit for tat. It happened to me, so it can happen to them, or it didn't happen to me, so it shouldn't happen to them. Rather, it's ethical. From my experiences, I have learned what is right and what is wrong. And so now I'm going to do what is right to others. This is part of loving others like yourself, loving your neighbor like yourself. It's also one of the reasons that in ancient societies, elders were given credit, they were elevated in the society, because it takes a number of years to gain the experience to deal knowledgeably and calmly and lovingly in life. You get, young men and women, they're all fired up and we've all been there, at least most of us. There may be a couple of young people here. But you know how you get so fired up when you're a young person, and that as you get older and you get seasoned, that you get a lot wiser, a lot more calm. And so this is ethical. You must not wrong a foreigner, nor are you to oppress him. You were foreigners and you know what it's like. Verse 22, you must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Now, some of the versions go orphans. The Hebrew text can be translated orphans, but I prefer fatherless child, because in that culture the widows were so disadvantaged that the children were disadvantaged not because they were orphans, but because they were fatherless. They didn't have the father figure in their life to guide them and protect them. And you certainly read about that in Proverbs. And there's a whole bunch of scriptures about how we're supposed to treat widows and fatherless children. And then verse 23, if you mistreat them, there's one of those polyptitons. And then they will cry out, and he doesn't even tell you what the consequence is right yet. He says, then they will cry out, yes, cry out to me, and I will hear, yes, hear. So verse 23 is very powerful. We're dealing with widows and fatherless children, or widows and orphans. And in 23, we have three different polyptitons in one verse. Does God want us to pay attention to that? Absolutely, he does. Does God care about widows and fatherless children? Absolutely, he does. And here's a great proof of it right here in verse 23. In verse 24, he says, my wrath will grow hot, and I will kill you with the sword, so that your wives will be widows and your children will be fatherless. Well, that's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's God says, and it's not that God's going to reach down and kill him here in this life, although that can happen. But it's really about God saying, look, if this is the way you're going to behave at the judgment, you're going to have real trouble. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of my people with you who are poor, you must not be to him as a creditor, nor are you to charge him interest. So basically, if you're going to lend money, you're doing it to help build society. You're not lending money to enrich yourself. You're lending money to build society. Then verse 26, if you take as collateral your neighbor's cloak, you must return it to him before the sun goes down, by the way, whether he's paid you back or not. Verse 27, for that's his only covering. It is his cloak for his skin. In what would he sleep? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So again, you're taking somebody's cloak as collateral for something you're lending him, but you have to return it to him. God's love is that we're going to protect the disadvantaged. So we return it to him even if we haven't been repaid. Verse 28, you must not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. Of course, we know from the New Testament we pray for our leaders. And then verse 29 goes into giving, your offerings and your tithe. Then do the same, verse 30, with your cattle and your sheep. And then verse 31, in conclusion, you are to be holy people to me. Therefore, you are not to eat any flesh that's torn to pieces in the field. You are to throw it to the dogs. So verse 31 gives, you're to be holy. And then there's a whole bunch of different things you can do to be holy. And it gives here as an example. And you and I are to do the same. We're to be holy to God. So there are things that we are supposed to do, the things that we are guided to do. And when we confess Christ as Lord, Christ said in Matthew 7, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? And I get the question, when we make Christ Lord, then we enter into a commitment to do what God says. So this stuff involves being sacrificial. It involves keeping the other person in mind. It involves trying to be just. It involves not worrying about enriching yourself at the expense of others. There's a lot of stuff in here that if we take it to heart, then we begin to learn to think like God thinks, which I think is what God wanted us to do. And the importance of it is, like I said in the beginning, stressed by this figure polyptiton, which occurs 13 times in this chapter. So thank you so much for listening, I really enjoyed preparing for this teaching. There's lots and lots of commentary to back up some of the things I said.